I am Janice Dempsey of Dempsey and Windle. Together with Donal, my husband, we publish only poetry, and we were very pleased when Mark came to us with his book, and we were able to publish it for him, or with him rather. So some of you know Mark, but I'm going to introduce him as though none of you do. Mark Haworth-Booth was born in Yorkshire in 1944 and grew up in Sussex. He studied English literature at Cambridge University and fine art at Edinburgh University, and worked as a curator from 1969 to 1970 at Manchester Art Gallery, and then for another 14 years at the Victoria and Albert Museum. He's published books on graphic design and photography, as well as articles in Vogue and the TLS. Mark and his wife Rosie have lived in North Devon since 2009. They're both active members of the Green Party and Extinction Rebellion. Mark's verse has appeared in national magazines since the 1980s, and he featured in New Voices at the South Bank Centre in 1992. The Thermobaric Playground presents Mark's poems in 4 overlapping sections. Habitat, in which the poems introduce the Devon countryside where the author lives. Second one is the Headlined World, in which he widens his focus to include the impact on nature of human activity. For the Birds is a section that celebrates wild and domesticated birds that live alongside us. And in the last section, Presences, he portrays people and the arts they create in the human environment. We loved Mark's poems when he submitted his collection to us for their honesty and their accessibility. Never didactic or prescriptive, he communicates his passion for nature and his fears for the future of our vulnerable planet in poems of remarkable clarity. We're looking forward to hearing some of them tonight, as well as poems from Mark's guest poets, Patricia Millner and Emily Haworth-Booth. So welcome everybody. Sit back and enjoy an hour of really lovely poetry. And Mark, will you start, please?
Thank you very much, Janice. Well, I mentioned to Fiona some time ago that being published by you reminded me of a film I saw when I was a child. It was about a little boy who saved up all his money for a bicycle, and he took his hard-earned money to the local auction, and somebody outbid him, and then it happened again. So he had a great feeling of rejection. And then, magically, the best bicycle of all, which was red, no one else bid because they realized that he'd been rejected so many times. I hope this sounds familiar to some of the poets in the audience. Anyway, he bought the red bicycle and life was wonderful. So thank you very much, Janice and Donal, for the red bicycle of this book. It's far grander and more wonderful than anything I had ever actually expected to happen. So I'm really grateful. And I'm really grateful to everybody for coming, from my family, my North Devon friends, my poetry friends, including Exeter Uncut particularly, my V&A friends, my photography friends, photomaniacs as Cartier-Bresson called us. All these people are here, and my many tribes are represented, and I'm thrilled to bits. Thank you. The book has an epigraph from a Moroccan poet, writer Tahar Ben Jelloun, which is a poem is open to all possibilities, to all ways of hearing. It needs accomplices. Well, my chief accomplice is here, just behind me, Rosie. And there's a poem in the book about her. Anyway, I want to start with a poem called Web, which is very short, but sets the scene. It's I wrote it after a wonderful essay by Mark Cocker, my favorite writer on nature and the environment. You may know his country diary column in The Guardian, and I've read most of his books, and I think he is fantastic. And I wanted to start with it because it does set the scene for the book, but also because he wrote something fantastic for the back cover. He said, I'll just read you the first bit. He said, "A bright, beautiful, brimming rattle bag of styles and subjects." And I think that's such a good way of putting it, because the poems are from the last 17 years, so they're pretty various. Webb, after Mark Cocker. Ecology affirms that everything belongs, and blackbirds' songs are sun and worms. It was quite a culture shock coming to North Devon from Wandsworth, because suddenly we were unplugged from all that kind of invisible electricity in London. And Rosie and I looked out of our bedroom window on our first night here, and we couldn't see anything or hear anything. And we thought, what have we done? Perfect peace. How could we let ourselves in for this? Anyway, the countryside has changed since I last lived in it, and it's now fully mechanized. And when people talked about during lockdown about just rediscovering silence, I thought, well, they couldn't have lived round here, because my neighbours were putting up a very beautiful new steel tractor shed, and the people in the vineyard were setting fire to the bracken and strimming. This poem is based on one by Andrew Marvell, the Horatian Ode from 1650, in which longer lines are undercut or qualified by shorter lines. It's called Listening and Hearing. 6 of the Herson buzzards soar and mew above the nagging of a chainsaw. See sounds of gulls up from the estuary, diggers clanking at the quarry. The peep-peep of a visiting kingfisher, a chopper clattering to Chivener. All kinds of bees buzzing around the jasmine, pop pouring from the postman's van. The ricocheting small arms fire of jackdaws, pheasant shoots blasting with 12 bores. Stallions and mares are whinnying on the hill, the whine of an electric drill. Southwesterlies are strengthening to a storm. The vineyard starts its bracken strim. Canada geese fly honking overhead. A truck beeps. Something's delivered. Cows' tongues slapping at water in the byre. The whir of bird scare wire. Nights thick with silence, solitude, dense black. A fighter bomber's thunderclap. Frisky ponies clip and jingle down the lane. Lorries grind up it full of stone. The wall of song of garden birds in spring. The screech of autumn hedge flailing. Half listening for the barking dogs of neighbours, we hear the drones of different mowers, and always quite distinct from general noise, the startling, close by, human voice.
Mark, could I
Yes.
just ask you to keep the papers away from the...
Oh, yes, sorry, yes. I know it makes a deafening sound, doesn't
Does
it?
it rustles badly?
I
Okay,
know.
don't worry, I'll edit that bit out.
Thank you. Yes, I know exactly what you mean. I want to read a poem that I regard as having a kind of superpower when I read it, because it was admired by Fiona Benson. So I feel it must be perfect. And I read it with surprising self-confidence for that very reason. But the other reason I feel a superpower is I'm wearing a t-shirt designed by Emily and Alice when they had a spoof fashion house called Spotlight on Destiny, which sold agitprop underwear and subversive lingerie to the world. So here is my other superpower. Precarity is a word I didn't know, and I suspect many of us didn't know until austerity was enforced by the coalition government in 2010, but now we know that word all too well. And this is a poem, St. Mark's Flies, about both insects and precarity. St. Mark's flies have this special name because they tend to emerge around the feast day of St. Mark, which I think is the 24th of April. St. Mark's flies. I met them one early evening of this long, late, insectless spring, sailing a mild breeze, swooping between the hedgerows, looping along, legs trailing, dangling through the air, riding their ski chairs, the westering sun landing smack on each millimetre broad back, filling each tiny body with infinity, these flying sparks of gold, careering aeronauts so bold at voyaging their earth, charged with cosmic warmth, and fearless, if precarious. Caring about the natural world inevitably makes one fear for biodiversity and makes one want to take a stand, which I did. Oh, sorry, before I come to that, I want to have another poem about interconnectedness. I'm no serious naturalist, but I'm interested, and I keep my eyes and ears open. And sometimes I see things which I have not read about in books and not in other poems. This is called A Walk in Spencer's Wood. Are you guarding a new cache of nuts for winter? You're surely old enough to know that I'm a threat. You come pouncing along a fallen branch. Each move you make too quick for me to see. Only your tail moves slowly. You shape it in bows and arcs. I think they're meant for me. But you've sprung to the bole of a beech and flattened yourself to the bark with your tail topmost, signalling. 3 quivers ripple your full stretched plume, and then a pause, and now 3 more, a pause, and then 3 more, like semaphore waved in the face of a dim-witted giant. I guess you're saying, I am here and mine, and start to gesture back, please stay, I'll go. But quicker than thought you disappear, leaving a sense of kinship in the air. I want to turn to the first poem in the next section, The Headlined World, because those poems are about the public issues, and we all know what those are. This one was written in 2014 when I had just read The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert, and when the Wilfred Owen Association launched a competition for a poem written in his spirit. And I thought there was a real connection between what he was trying to do, I explain what was really happening at the front to people who preferred not to know, and those who are trying to get something done about climate change and addressing people who don't really want to know. So this is called the Anthropocene, and it's based directly on the form of a Wilfred Owen poem. Everything's mobile in this time of global flows: money, people, goods, bacteria, and disease. Something's affecting frogs, bats, bees, and now the trees, too set in their ways for new climates and viruses. How were we to know? A fungus gnaws away at bats in hibernation in New England, white nose. The bats wake up and fly in search of prey in midwinter. 6 million die. A European fungus, a probable extinction. We were not to know. Have all the golden frogs now gone from Panama? When an African fungus smears spores on their skin, it closes down their osmoregulation system. Watch them wave goodbye to Sir David and his camera. How were we to know? Great auks were favoured by the early mariners, easy to catch as picking fruit and good to eat. Birds were used for fuel, their fellows fried with the heat. The last great auks were killed in Iceland for collectors. We were not to know. We're still working our way through the planetary menu, just finishing the charismatic megafauna. Why take an aspirin when there's white horn rhino powder? Just one last slice of bluefin tuna, then adieu. How are we to know? We are as gods, so of course we're having a blast. The first species to enact, willfully or not, and as effectively as some vast meteorite, a mass extinction. It's the sixth, our first and last. We were not to know. Nearing the climax of the climate wars, our slow commanders somehow can't provide decisive orders. The attrition goes on with chainsaws and Toyotas. There's a soughing in the trees. You were not to know? How could you not know? Well, I want to hand over to Emily, who Janice will introduce, but first I want to say that, as you heard from Janice before, my wife and I, Rosie, joined Extinction Rebellion in the beginning of 2019, and of course our daughters had already been climate change campaigners, bold and courageous for many years before that. So over to you, Janice.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was a lovely reading. It always brings poems to life when they're in the mouth of the person that wrote them. They're lovely. Thank you. And now we're going to meet Emily, and she's a writer and illustrator from London. Her children's picture books, The King Who Banned the Dark and The Last Tree, have been translated into multiple languages and shortlisted for several awards, including the Waterstone Children's Book Prize. Her most recent publication, Protest: How People Have Come Together to Change the World, was co-authored with her sister, Alice. Emily is currently working on an Arts Council England funded graphic novel about the climate crisis and a prose poetry hybrid novel about a horse. She was a Foyle's Young Poet and has received poetry and art commissions from institutions including the Wellcome Trust and the Crafts Council. Her first poetry pamphlet is forthcoming from Thamesis Press. And Emily is going to read from a script, which I now am going to attempt to screen share, if I can find it again. 1 minute.
Thank you, Janice. Yeah, we thought it would be nice to show the text with the images because that's how it was originally conceived, and it's a long poem inspired by witnessing my father, Mark Haworth-Booth, being arrested for Extinction Rebellion and the photographs taken during that witnessing.
So I hope you can see.
Would you mind just going on to the second page just so I can check that the text is big enough for me to read?
Yes.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's fine. Okay, perfect. And the page before is the first one. Great, thank you. Before he was arrested, the arrestee flung his phone at the witness, which she used to take 126 photographs of shadows falling over the arrestee's body, of the larger bodies of the arresters closing around the smaller body of the arrestee, the way petals close over the center of a flower at night, of the arrestee letting his body go limp, a fawn in the eye beam of a wolf, of 4 arresters carrying the body of the arrestee, one at each limb, of the arrestee as a shape in motion, of the arrestee appearing for a moment to be dead, of the arrestee as low-vis, blocked from view by the high-vis bodies of the arresters, of the visible corners of the arrestee's unzipped zip-up blouson and tilting flat cap still gamely clinging to the arrestee's head, of the portion of the arrestee's shin glimpsed between sock and trouser cuff and a gap in the bodies of the arresters, of the arrestee placed on the pavement, of the arrestee propped against the wall, of his legs out in front of him, lolling his head, a cloth doll.
No.
Oh, could you go back, sorry?
Oh, sorry.
Of the arrestee blinking and coming to, of the faraway look in the arrestee's eyes, the arrestee no longer sitting on the pavement on the south end of Waterloo Bridge, but elsewhere, on the bank of a mill pond, at a long-lost address that will never be written in a police notebook. The Thames is such a quiet river, he might be thinking, muffled by the rustle of the arrester's jackets and the general bustle of arrest, he can barely even hear its civil sloshing. Of the arrestee thinking how he had a river once, all its intricate music buried now under 5,000 million litres of reservoir, though he will never not hear it falling over the weir steps the first night he slept in that house, not crashing, but one continuous movement, one long wet song. People think of rivers as things that flow, but once they knew them as things that spread, he thinks. Rivers used to live a more lateral life, splaying his hands outwards from his hips as the witness takes 51 more photos of the arrestee spreading his fingers on the tarmac, of the arrestee dragged to his feet, of the arrestee's anorak frisked for knives, explosives, glue, of the arrestee thumbed by blue gloves, of the handcuffing of the arrestee making eye contact with the witness, of the arrestee's first position feet, heels in, toes out, of the arrestee as Chaplin's tramp, of the arrestee's navy lunch bag hanging from the wrist of the arrestor, of the arrestee as son and the arrestor as father, preparing for the first day of school, though the arrestee is old enough to be the arrestor's father. Of the arrestee climbing onto the van as onto a school bus, of the silhouette of the arrestee indistinct among the shapes of the other arrestees seen through the windows of the van as it tucks itself into the traffic on the roundabout and is gone. A man was stopped from sitting down on a bridge, the witness thinks. He was stopped from stopping, which means it is the state of arrest itself that has been arrested. And so, ironically, the act of arresting something already still forces it into movement, onto its feet, onto its back, into the air, in motion down the long bridge towards the vans, round the roundabout, up the road and away. This arrest, she thinks, is the arresting of arrestedness, the cause of movement of an otherwise still body, which might make the witness consider the inadequacy of worn-out language to express present truths and almost enjoy for a moment the absurdity of it all, of the naming of arrest as arrest, when in fact what is happening here is the forcing of an already self-arrested body that wishes to be still, that would make stillness an implement, to be reabsorbed into the relentless forward motion of late capitalism, which though described in this way might sound like a river, is very much not. Instead, later, uploading the 126 photos, the witness looks at each version of her father, and although she has read several times the leaflet which says that arrestees will likely be released within 12 to 24 hours, the image that stains her is that of her father, the arrestee, being borne along a fast-moving current, slipping or being pushed downstream. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was lovely. Thank you. Quite unexpected. I didn't have time to read it before I showed it to everybody, and I'm very impressed. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
And now we go back to Mark. And
Thank you,
Mark,
Janice.
you are unmuted, and off you go. Read again for us, please.
Thank you so much, Emily. Oh, goosebumps. I want to read a poem now, which is a documentary poem. As some of you know, I'm very interested in documentary photography, and I tried to write this poem because I wanted to capture what it was like to be at one of the most extraordinary literary events I've ever attended. And I was there with Rosie, Emily, and Alice in the autumn of 2019. Rising. Trafalgar Square, an evening in October. The southeast corner, beside a wooden tower, quickly assembled out of Lego slotted panels with 4 locked on. A woman seated 10 feet up looks relaxed as darkness falls. One arm encased within the structure, she smiles down at the crowd in front of the makeshift soundstage. We sit and listen for the drifts of samba drumming coming from the Strand, and waves of singing much closer at hand. A line of rebels gathered round the comrades who superglued their skin to nearby roads. When the police make rushes towards them, we hear their voices strengthen with our anthem, belting out, "People gonna rise like water. We're gonna face this crisis now." I hear the voice of my great-granddaughter saying, "Keep it in the ground." Now Ali Smith and A.L. Kennedy, the rebel writers, passionate and funny, perform in shifting rainbow washes, violets, blues, yellows, pinks, and soon the first rain spits. Everyone's crew, we say, but there's real know-how, rigging good mics and lighting. Philip Hoare, in shorts, is imitating the bright clicks of killer whales he met in the Atlantic. A man in high-vis bursts in from the side, shouting, "Arrestables, now please, 4 needed." And a young couple get up straight away, 2 older volunteers following more slowly. We listen to a Greenland woman's ice words, and then a Marshall Islands girl's salt words. For one new land is melting into being, while sea rise sinks the other's beaches, home and fields. The future starts to flow around our Lock-on's tower, lapping at the embassies and lions, now edging up the column from which Nelson keeps his weather eye on duty being done below, with all the flags fluttering XR and heavy seas arriving from Trafalgar. I'm a member of Amnesty, and a few years ago, Amnesty asked us to do various things to help Raif Badawi, who was a blogger in Saudi Arabia who was locked up. And Amnesty asked us to do things like print out a picture of Raif and do a selfie with him. And I did that, and I thought, well, that's not quite enough, is it? So I read his book, and I want to share something I found in his book. Raif. I want to break the walls of ignorance, Raif Badawi posted in his blog. They threw him in a cell to teach him sense. How simple Raif's requests. Freedom of speech, the rights of women and minorities. What platitudes to have to preach. Raif's wretched, filthy, lice-infested jail, with its foul toilets and obscene graffiti, has, he discovers on a sticky wall, words that recharge his resolution. He reads with great astonishment that secularism is the solution, exactly what he'd written in his blog. And Raif Badawi's fetid Saudi prison fills for a moment with pure oxygen. I wrote this next poem in the summer of 2018. It's called Pop, and it is about the normalization of the Putin dictatorship by allowing the World Cup of men's football to be held in Russia. And the reason why that happened is that Roman Abramovich had a private meeting with the head of FIFA, and at the end of that meeting, Gazprom was paying FIFA millions as sponsor. That's how it happened. And so it's about the normalization of this monster. Pop, summer 2018. This is a word that health professionals love. Just pop onto the couch and pop your top off. Just pop into this dressing gown. Pop this thermometer into your mouth for me. To say the word does make the world seem fun. Somehow suggests a jolly, upbeat tempo. It won't be long before the politicians start using it. Dictators too, perhaps. I had some of our operatives pop over to UK, pop down to Salisbury, and pop some Novichok on someone's door, then pop home Maybe they'll pop back sometime. Who pops polonium into pots of tea? Pops the opposition into prison? Pops prescribed drugs into a nation's athletes? Pops bullets into troublesome reporters? Pops mass misinformation and denials into news feeds and chat rooms on the net? And pops $200 billion into his many undeclared, most private bank accounts. Instead, let's pop on wild, outrageous clothes. Pop some music on, pop round to see a friend, pop to wherever always cheers us up, then pop home early for some more World Cup. I want to just read another from this section of the headlined World, which was written in February. It's the title poem, The Thermobaric Playground, Day 19. And it's in two parts. It's quite short, 3 stanzas to start with, and then a slight pause, and then a coda of 3 lines. I think thermobaric is a word we didn't know until February, most of us, and it refers to vacuum bombs which suck the oxygen out of human lungs. The Thermobaric Playground, Day 19. The fight, threatened for months, is in full swing. A creepy bully who lies, cheats and steals picked on a smaller, well-liked boy whom we cheer on and shout advice to while he's battered. Teachers and seniors say they cannot intervene, but tell us no one is allowed to leave. It's known that the aggressor has a weapon which he'll use if cornered. No one will be safe. Helpless and shamed, we go on watching a psychotic beat the shit out of a kid. Some start to walk around the playground talking to themselves, mouthing "Puh, puh, 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 puh." President Putin has decided that today he'll teach Ukraine about the vacuum bomb. His lesson takes a preschool's breath away. So may I hand back to Janice, please, to introduce Pat.
Thank you very much, Mark. That was very creepy, that last poem. Thank you. And very apt, unfortunately. And now I'm going to introduce Pat Millner. Pat grew up in South Africa, leaving long ago to study in England. During the apartheid years, it wasn't possible to return to Africa because her husband was a banned person. But she now goes back as often as money and conscience about flying will allow. I'm sorry, I've lost half of this.
I'm sure we can do without it, Janice.
Well, you are a writer. Pat is a writer who's been published many times in good magazines and journals, and she writes poems, and we're really looking forward to hearing them. Pat, please carry on, please.
Thank you, Janice. I was very, very confused about what would fit tonight. So I thought I'd just concentrate on where I am and what I'm doing. I seem to have become obsessed about, well, a connectedness and the loss of language. Language and thoughts that are lost to us because either the speakers are so old that there's no record, or languages that have effectively been eliminated. And I've been traveling this last week on an astonishing expedition into the mountains to see the San indigenous people's cave paintings, which are wonderful but difficult and enigmatic. And also learning more about the efforts to keep their deeply imperiled language alive. So I did a bit of archaeology through my own poems and came up with a few that kind of fitted that theme. So I hope that'll be okay. And the first one comes from very far back and is called Lucy, after our ancestress in Ethiopia. Lucy, outside, Bulldozers shoulder old Addis Ababa aside. Here, in your glass coffin, your bones are silent. What is there to say? It's 3 million years since that sultry dusk when mothers and their young, frolicking on the bank, screamed like frantic birds as the swamp sucked you in. Time unpicked you, slowly, winnowing flesh from bone while the silt pressed down. Line by line, your story forgot itself in schist and shale. Your clan unknew its name. We resurrected you from the weathered hill, held you up, avid to make you the first chapter of a new Genesis. We gathered your fragments and danced for joy under a diamond sky. We stand in line now to visit you, stripped of your life out on the grassy plain. What is there to say? Australopithecus afarensis, Madonna of the Stones, tiny relic, maybe mother. Forgive us our sacrilege. Pray for us all. Coming forward a few millennia to 73,000 BCE. Artist unknown, an engraved stone from the Blombos cave. Why does this tiny pyramid of calcrete unsettle me so? 70,000 years under the cave floor haven't blurred the grid of cross-hatched lines you left on it. The sea is indifferent, still surges below on red rocks like the one you must have honed to pencil point to make your forceful mark here on the stone. But troweled out from junk of abalone, mussel shells, cracked bones from last suppers, this meaning's petrified. I ought to get your message. Pollock, Miro, Mondrian speak to me with lines they left, but yours elude. Can only say that once you, too, had an idea, insisted you made it concrete, and take your sharpened ochre crayon and begin to draw. And then coming forward a bit more, the Golden Rhino from Mapungubwe, which is a very beautiful artifact that was found in the north of South Africa and hastily consigned to a basement because it completely subverted the view of the surrounding people who had made it. The sculptor dreamt you out of sunlight, acacia scent, and your horned shadow on the dead grass, then buried you to keep the nightmares from the dead king. You were bundled away hurriedly next time, your story covered like a hornless corpse before the vultures could spread it to the eavesdropping sky. But you've charged, head down out of the grave, scattering white lies, uprooting history like a smashed baobab, and skid to a halt, your shining hide ablaze.
That was lovely. Thank you very much. The rhino. Wow. And I remember very well Lucy being discovered. I can't remember exactly when it was, but extraordinary, extraordinary subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
Very relevant to everybody today as well.
Thank you for letting me read them.
Well, thank you for reading. And now one more set of poems from Mark. And Mark, are you ready to read?
Thank you, Janice. Thank you so much, Pat. Wonderful. I want to read a poem called Report, which is by a Czech anarchist poet called Franja Šramek, which I heard in the original Czech when I took my dear friend Markéta Luskačová, very distinguished photographer, to see Warhorse in London. I thought she'd like it because the Czechs are so into puppet theatre. And at the interval, she started reciting this poem to me. And then she explained the meaning of it. And I have realized lately that I have a quixotic side to my character. And I decided then and there that I would have Marketa recite this poem to Michael Morpurgo, who I did not know, but I live in Devon. So all this came to pass one August when Marketa was staying with us, and I rang Robin Revilius and explained what I would like to happen, and she immediately rang the Morpurgi, as she calls them, and that Thursday we sat around her table in Chumley and Marketa recited this poem. And it was wonderful watching Michael's face, and that's why he's written the most generous stuff about me on the back of my book. So, and I just want to mention that I wrote this translation when I was studying with Andy Brown at Exeter, and I followed the original versification very strictly, and I showed it to Andy, and he said, "That's fine, Mark, now you need to loosen it up." And I was thrilled that he said that, because there were things I wanted to put in that I couldn't put in until I loosened it up. So I'll always associate this poem with Andy's very good advice. And I should explain one other thing, that Marketa explained to me that in Czech poetry you can just switch tenses of languages quite naturally. Report by Franja Šramek, translated from the Czech with Marketa Luskačová. I'll take up my position on the left of the rear guard, and no one will understand what I must ask, no good friend or comrade, as I stand, heels clicking and toes apart. I must present you, sir, with my report of the strange dream I had. Sir, I must report this dream I had to you. The war had come, and I was lying shot. Your horse had fallen too. I am not asking whether God brought us to die together. I am sure that it is true. It was nearly dawn, the moon reddening, when your horse raised his head. He had, like me, been shot in the stomach. As the living warmth bled from his eyes, I saw someone sorrowing within them, someone wondering, inquiring, and grieving for the dead. The meadow is scented with clover and nasturtium in flower. And he, the horse, of what could he be guilty? His belly is a crater. He feels his rider's weight no more, and his eyes, so full of questions, still implore. His throat is getting drier. Oh, the throat is getting dry, and he would like to neigh, and he doesn't know why. Golden sun, did he not love you, and you reject him? Why? These horseshoes used to ring out far ahead. Why are the legs leaden, the sky streaming red? The world is turning. Why? I report, sir, that my dream took me into hell. The eyes of the animal were shrieking, and I saw their jelly heave and swell, almost writhing from the sockets. Do I know why we lie here with all those holes below, with no sweet lie to tell? I report, sir, and ask you to respond. We men go gladly, knowing we must face death when we receive our master's command. But save the horses, I beg you again, for the animal asks me to explain why his breathing must end. There's a little section called For the Birds, the third section. I'd like to read one poem from this, and it was occasioned by just observing a very familiar bird. Not long after I'd been to a lecture by George Monbiot at Dartington Hall, and then he brought out his book Feral, which had a little more of the background to this poem. Metamorphoses. I should say that this was published in the Broadsheet, edited by Simon Williams and Susan Taylor, which has been such a wonderful kind of support to poets in the South-West. This small bird isn't yet in grown-up plumage, all speckled brown and black with no red breast, but I know it for a robin from the way it thrips and throps, comes close a foot or two from where I stand, looks sidelong, sussing me. Who, or more likely what, does this newcomer think I am? Well, George Monbiot would say that local English robins regard us as boars, wild boars, that is, beasts capable of digging, rooting around and bringing up the worms. It seems that when the Anglos killed the boars, the robins switched to us as new companions. It's what George calls a ghost ecology. What does my new friend really make of me? Perhaps a disappointing JCB? I'm going to read a slightly long poem, I'm afraid, and then finish with a very short one. This one I've chosen because I really owe Janice for rescuing it. We talked over the phone and she said, I really like the way it ends. And she read back my words to me and I was terribly touched that she put so much into that. And then she said, but it's about a page too long. And this stanza here is just a list of pre-Raphaelite painters, I think. It's a bit clunky, isn't it? So I immediately rewrote it. And the thing was that I had sent it to PN Review in Manchester in January and heard nothing. And so I said, well, I wrote to Michael Schmidt, the editor, and said, I've rewritten this poem. I hope you don't mind me resending it. And it's going to be in my book. And he immediately wrote back saying, yes, we'd like to take this. And the reason I didn't write before was I wasn't sure. So it's a way of saying thank you to Janice for everything, especially for saving this poem. Meeting Mr. Lowry, after a poem by Sinead Morrissey. 1970, the city was scrubbing off soot, turning its back-to-backs to rubble and gradually receding from his paintings. A pretty colleague ventured with me to Mottram in Longondale. He was large but bird-like, a dark-suited stalk, quizzical movements of the head, sharp eyes, unexpected. When Sandra admired a picture, he immediately offered it to her. Knowing her museum ethics, she gave a gracious no to the small painting of the sea, empty, white, and lonely, and it stayed on his mantelpiece. We wondered if this was a test or trick, but Lowry warmed to us, it seems. The curtains remained closed, his clocks all ticked, and he became less guarded, eventually inviting us to the sanctum of his picture-hung bedroom. A brass bedstead, on the walls, flame-haired women in red pastel or chalk. I think about a dozen, all of them Rossetti's, Lowry's greatest prize. We stood and looked and looked. Imagine being kissed by those lips, he suddenly exclaimed, pointing at a portrait titled Reverie, Jane Morris, by her lover, obsessed Rossetti. Lowry proposed lunch, and we took the bus together back to town from Greater Manchester. We'll find a soup kitchen, he joked, but chose respectable dining at the Midland Hotel. Afterwards, the short walk to the art gallery, our gallery, but also his, which he'd from early youth frequented. I remember how he gazed, his tall figure statuesque, at a 6-foot picture labelled Astarte Syrica, by, of course, Rossetti, an unchristian trinity with Jane Morris in the centre and 2 younger beauties as angel-winged attendants, one her daughter May, both of them red-headed and holding redder flames. I watched for several minutes as Lowry stood enraptured. Was he lost in the waves of her hair, Jane's lustrous chevelure, or willing her slender fingers to loosen the spangled girdle with which they toy, and the goddess reveal her blinding nakedness? Was he worshipping his muse, an oriental Venus and early Aphrodite, for whom nothing is above the the one commandment to love, rather than looking at a Rossetti. He didn't paint like that, no need, it had been done. What Lowry did was paint with unassuageable love how people are uncommon, how folk are and live, sometimes lonely as the sea. I want to finish with this short poem called Core. And one of the things I've really loved about doing this book, which is a terrifically generous 120 pages long, is to be able to embrace many of my friends and family, especially some of the departed. And this is in memory of my Aunt Sylvia Marvell Barker. Core. We grow new cells, our microbes come and go. So do we change our deep identity? Well, no philosopher, I'd like to know if there's a me that goes right back to infancy, back to my womb life during the last war, a me that's made by dangers, deaths, and rages. If psyches could be measured like an ice core, the ones that show the climate's hidden ages, might we trace shocks, but also in between kindnesses, falling light as pollen?